Hello there, and welcome to part 3 of the Ricochet training series. If you haven't seen part 1 and 2 talking about the basics, you probably should check those out. Otherwise, this one might be kind of confusing. Alright, I've got that Megascans model in here. We need a Ricochet under extensions or plugins. Select Ricochet, creates it. I'd like to see, let's just make it a bright white this time. So under basic, display color on bright white. So I'd like the Ricochet source to be object mode and feed in the model, hide the original source. So there we go. We're bouncing around inside the model. This time we're going to be talking about some of the options under modify and mostly the source geometry. We already talked about time offset and point cap in the previous video. So let's work our way through these, and we're going to start at the bottom and work our way up because they get more interesting as we go. First up is polygon selection. In this model, I've got some polygon selected down here, pretty much a hole in the neck. Inverting that, UI as a shortcut. I've now selected all these outer ones. I'd like to create a selection tag, but we can actually do that automatically with Ricochet. Clicking the create button, it will find whatever your source object is and create a selection tag based on your current selection. Just saves you a couple clicks. So Ricochet will only see geometry that's involved in the selection tag if you add a selection tag in here. So in this case, it's bouncing around inside the model. And if we select Ricochet and begin increasing the length, it's going to bounce, 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 bounce. And then eventually a bounce escapes down through the hole that we put in the mesh because that just isn't selected. So that is potentially useful to somebody somewhere. But the main reason I added this in is because selection tags are really cool in the fact that you can, of course, turn on use fields. And if we're using a field, then we can do something like delete the freeze, which is the previous information, and add in a random field. So this random field is, let's double click it. You can see we get this crazy selection where the random field is showing. So we have the ability to take that field and remap it. So under remapping, do something like a curve, and then drag that remapping so that we will, and we always unfortunately have to double click a couple times, but now those are the only selections, so I guess I want the opposite. Let's pull this up some more and then double click. So you see that there's only inverting temporarily. You see there's only a couple of holes in there. So that is now the selection. So that is what it's seeing. So if we were to make a bunch of these, well, first of all, you could bounce around a bunch of times, but it's still escaping out some random hole. So let's do the matrix trick we were doing before. So let's say we create a matrix, but I don't want the matrix with those settings, so we'll change it from object to radial mode. And I'll temporarily turn off the Ricochet so you can see what I'm doing. I want the radius to be 0, and we'll make a bunch of them. Oop, and we'll make a bunch of these. So now turning on the Ricochet, we now got a bunch of those bouncing around, and they are escaping out the holes randomly. So that can also be animated under the random field. I can say, hey, animation speed is 55, not too fast, but if I hit play, now they're bouncing around and occasionally escaping out various holes inside of that selection tag. So if I turn on the model, you see that occasionally we'll get some laser shooting out. There's potentially uses for that. I really like the power of fields when it comes to selection tags, so I just wanted to open up this opportunity to make some more advanced rigs with Ricochet. Having said that, let's move on to the next feature. So we don't need a bunch of this. Delete, delete, and delete the selection tag. So essentially, put the orientation back to Z+, and we're back to basics. This is the original setup. The next option we have is actually the See Normals option. So currently, Ricochet is going to see the front of a polygon. It's going to see the back of a polygon. It bounces off any geometry that it sees. Grabbing the Ricochet, let's scoot it way back here. You'll see that it's behaving like a laser. It's hitting the surface and, as if it's a mirror, and it's bouncing off. That's all well and good, but that's because it's seeing the front and back of a polygon. If we say, hey, don't see the front of it, I just want to see the back of it, then what's happening is the laser can pass through a normal that's facing the positive direction. They like the orange normal. If I select this model, you'd see that these are orange. If I hit UR to invert, actually, you might not see it until we delete the tag. But just as a quick example, you see these are very orange. If I hit UR to invert the normals, it's very blue. So, having said that, it doesn't see the orange side of a normal, and now it's bouncing around the side. But this actually opens up some cool opportunities because if I hit R for rotate and select the object, I can rotate this so we kind of have this laser where it's like me, and then bzz, and me as it moves away. So it kind of opens up the opportunity for that to travel in and bounce around all over the model. Having said that, we've also got the front side. And this one's maybe less useful, but for completeness, it's there. Resetting the position of this is bouncing around on the inside because, of course, when it's bouncing around on the inside, it's only seeing blue, 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 blue. It can't escape. So if we say instead we want to see the front side, it can now pass right through the blue side of that. And then creating a second mesh of some sort. Let's make a sphere. T for scale. C to make it editable. And then selecting the polygons. Currently, it's not doing us any good because we need to see the orange side, so I'll invert that. The shortcut for that is UR, and now the orange is on the inside. So if we tell Ricochet to also see the sphere, and then hide the sphere, now it's passing right through the head model and then bouncing around on the sphere. Let's have this bounce a bunch of times, so crank that up. Let's add another 0. Let's add another 0. Now it's bouncing around a ton of times, and what's neat is if we zoom in, the interior of the head is going to be empty of splines except for that original one, which will pass right through the wall. So, I'm sure there's some really cool use cases for it, but that's just keeping all of that in mind. Let's lower the length and delete the sphere. And let's go, and also set this back to default again of both. So now we're back to the beginning, no modifications again. Zip. Next up, let's take a look at the visualize shell, surface offset, and even some bevel threshold. Let's turn this into some geometry. Specifically, holding down Alt as I create a sweep will make that a parent of it, and Mac, that would be option you hold. Holding down Shift as I create a end side will put that as a child. I would like the radius to be 2, and we'll give it a couple extra sides just so it looks smoother. And let's get this bouncing around a bunch more. So let's say the length is up, so bounce, 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 bounce. And actually, you'll see that some of these are getting really spiky. And they're getting really spiky and escaping the model. Let's make it even worse. I'm going to go to normal, so it's going to align with the polygon. We'll crank that up, and as I do, you're going to see we're going to get even more of those, and they get even sharper. Why is this happening? Well, it's because of the sweep. You've probably run into this before when you're playing with a sweep, where you suddenly get this big old spike shooting out to infinity. We compensated for this in Ricochet. So under Modify, I can go to the bevel threshold, and this is going to find the sharp angles and bevel them. So it's going to bevel them by 0.5, and as long as we take off that sharp corner, it actually behaves really well. So with that bevel threshold, just start dragging it up, and you'll see the sharpest one disappears first, and as I drag it further and further and further, more and more of them will smooth out. And there's really no downside to it. I mean, it's creating extra points, but now those are all getting smoothed out and none are shooting all crazy outside the model. That's how bevel threshold is useful. Now, back to Ricochet's main tab. I would like this not to be normal. Let's do surface and lots of surface alignment. And then let's do from surface rotation, and we'll crank that up a bit just so it kind of does some more randomness around. What I would like to do is you see that the Ricochet is actually perfectly trapped within the object, but now that we have a mesh that has some thickness, that mesh is escaping outside of our model. So how can we fix that? Well, if we jump into Modify, we've got a shell offset, and that's what I'd like to play with here. Let's go to the front view, so middle mouse click, and then we can go to the side view and turn on Visualize. And then grab surface offset and you can drag it up. Oh, and I forgot, you have to be in object mode to see this. So if you select object mode, we'll see some dots now. And that's what visualize is doing. We can drag up surface offset and you'll see some orange dots are pushing away from the model. Or we can grab it and start pulling negative. They'll turn blue, which means they're inside the model now, and they're shrinking that. Now we gave that a end side with a thickness of 2, well, it's 4 all the way across, but 2 is the radius. So if we say, hey, Ricochet, I want you to be -2 as well, the same thickness. Let's turn off Visualize and go back to our 3D view. We can now see that all of the sweep is perfectly trapped within the object. It's not escaping outside of it anymore. And I was really, really excited when we figured out a way to do this because it really unlocks a lot of power to keep a model completely trapped on the inside. So let's crank that up a little bit more. Let's put some extra length. Let's put an extra 0, which might be too much. But now we've got this model bouncing around, doing a really nice job of keeping this shell trapped. Now, this is perfectly kind of traveling around the outside of this model. We could do the opposite. We could say, hey, let's push it out. We know it's it's 4 thick, so let's push it the opposite, which will be +2. And now these lines are kind of wiggling around the outside of the model. You might intuitively think that these lines are perfectly outside the model. However, if I start zooming in and we start passing through the model, you'll see that there's actually quite a few of them bouncing around on the inside of the model. And why is that? Well, that is because we are aligning to the surface, but we're not like stuck to the surface. So when we hit a polygon, we're taking on its angle. But if it doesn't collide with a new polygon, it can't turn. So that means, let me see if it's a good spot to explain. If you have something like the hair bun here, this will collide and then take on the angle and kind of travel around. But once it hits this curvature, it's not going to suddenly turn to travel along the head again. It'll just continue in a straight line until it collides with something else again. So how do we compensate for that? How do we fix this problem? What we need to do is give it a shell, something on the outside to bounce off of and something on the inside to bounce off of. So to simplify the show, I will turn off the sweep and make the line not quite so long and back to the side view or the front, and under modify I would like to visualize again. Let's even get rid of the surface offset, and this time we've got a shell. If I start increasing that, you'll see that some orange dots push out and some blue dots push in. What that is going to do is create a shell in between the two that we can go and trap the Ricochet. Now, a couple quick notes. First of all, like I said, you have to be in object mode to see this. Originally, we were drawing lines in between them, but those took a really long time to calculate, so we thought these dots were kind of a nice halfway point. But you shouldn't have visualize turned on all the time. Just like the field forces where it'll display those little vector lines. Those take time to calculate, so only have this on if you're changing these settings and then turn it off. Otherwise, it'll take some unnecessary time to calculate. Now, this is bouncing around. The Ricochet is currently bouncing around inside, and it is seeing the front and back of the normal, so it's actually trapped inside this blue section. So how do we actually get it in the shell? Well, that is pretty straightforward. All we need to do is move the Ricochet until it starts in between those two layers, and we should kind of see, and actually a good way to do this is move it out and then move it in until suddenly we see it reacting, and now it's in between those two layers. From the front view, it's really hard to tell. Let's turn off the visualize, and now let's go to the 3D view, and now we can see as I rotate around that it's very well trapped in between those two layers, meaning let's crank up the length again and crank it up some more. And now we're sweeping all over this thing, creating a really neat web effect. If we deselect it, we got that white line. Here's this webbing traveling along the entire thing. Turning back on the sweep, you can now see that as I zoom into the model, the inside is now hollow and all of the lines are just trapped within the shell. So that's working exactly perfectly, exactly what I want it to do. Let's simplify again, turning off the sweep and make the length not so long so that, actually, let me show you. If we leave the length really long, of course, it plays really quick. If I play, it's caching that, the spline, and it doesn't need to refresh. But if I were to start dragging this, it's going to have to recalculate the entire length. So you see, it's not going to freeze or anything, but it's going to take a long time to calculate as it's rebuilding the entire thing from scratch. So that's why I'm lowering the length as I do this. So back to a front view. I would like the Ricochet to visualize the shell. And this time, let's have these entirely trapped on the outside of the model. We know the model is 2 units thick, so let's make the shell 2 and then push it out 4, because that means we're compensating for the thickness of the sweep, so it can't sneak inside the model at all. The model will be 100% hollow. Having done that, once again, grab the Ricochet. In this case, I'll move it outside the shell and then scoot it in until we suddenly see it react. Now we know it's trapped within. Hide the visualize, crank up the length again, and we'll go to 20,000. And now that is sweeping all over, turning on again the sweep. We can even delete the visualize tags, the display tag rather, on the model. And now you can see this is sweeping on the outside of the model, and it shouldn't be going inside it at all. So that opens up so many possibilities for actually getting complete control over the way this is traveling around the model. Now, we've been running this in a sweep. There's lots of different ways of visualizing a spline, obviously. Let's try another one. We don't need the sweep anymore. Delete that, and let's feed the Ricochet into a volume builder. So I'll hold down Alt or Option on the Mac, and it will create that as a parent, and then hold down Alt as I create a mesher, and now it creates a mesh. This mesher is, the resolution's not high enough, so we'll decrease our voxel size. Drop that to, in this case, 2 should be a good number. And then selecting the spline inside it, I want the radius also to be 2. And we need more sampling, so the density should go up to 1, at least 1. We can go higher if we wanted to. And now you can see that these are kind of traveling around and they're blobbing into each other. So this opens up the ability to kind of create some blobs or a different type of webbing. We could thicken this radius up a bit if we wanted to. I really like creating a smoothing deformer. Drop that as a child of the mesher, and it's going to kind of melt those together better and just makes this really neat pattern. So it runs quickly in this demo. I could select that Ricochet, really, let's pull the length of that down. And actually even that, you can see how we could keyframe this and let that kind of draw on, leave a little bit of that, put the grow on. Actually, the grow will automatically do it for us. So if I hit play, that's not going to be drawing around and creating it. Keep in mind the volume mesher is recalculating completely every time. So it's going to go slower and slower and slower as there's more to calculate. And then, we could even, put a little bit of this length and then crank up the rate, and now that rate will be offset, so it's not getting longer, but it's going to travel around and show different bits of the mesh as it goes. Lots of different options. I really enjoy playing with the volume builder and mesher in conjunction with this. Let's add that extra, let's do 5. Maybe that's a little too much. 3. Yeah, back to this nice big blob. And the smoothing, actually, here's a little hint. In smoothing, crank the stiffness down all the way, and then you don't need as many iterations, and everything will run quicker for you. So yeah, it creates a really cool blob. You can imagine doing some Venom type effects with this look, or slime, or ooze, or wax. Like, it really opens up a lot of opportunities. So that should cover this video where we're talking about some of these different modify options. The next one, we should be talking about some of these advanced Ricochet options. Oop, there's one last setting that I almost forgot to mention that is important. Creating a new Ricochet and a default cube. We'll drop the cube in as actually we'll make it a source. So Ricochet, object, and a source geometry will be the cube, hide the cube. So this is bouncing around. I want more bounces. There's a setting underneath modify, underneath technical, and it's called backtrack. What backtrack does is we're doing collision detection, where the ray is shooting out and it's colliding with a polygon. We're figuring out what polygon it collides with. And then what we're doing calculation-wise is we're saying, okay, now back up just a little bit and then go your new direction. Because if we don't backtrack at all, then it'll be exactly right on that polygon in the exact same space. And that means, it's kind of like, well, if you're exactly in the same place as a polygon, are you above it or are you below it? And it doesn't know, and so the spline might escape if that's the case. Now, our default value here is 0.01, which is really small, and you really won't be able to tell the difference. But 99.9% of the time, you'll never need to think about the setting or ever change it. But if you're working in a very, very small scene, so let's say that this cube is only 1 by 1 by 1, it gets really, really tiny. So hit the letter S to zoom up on it. And now the Ricochet is going a lot further because it's a total length, and this is now way smaller. So I'll divide that by 10. You can see we're getting all those bounces. Viewing this from the side, and again hitting the letter S to zoom in, you'll see that as this is bouncing, it's not quite getting to the edge anymore, because when this cube is only 1 unit wide, then 0.1 is actually kind of a significant percentage of it. So you can always go into the backtrack and say, okay, that's a smaller number, say 0.01, and now you see it gets way closer to the edge. And we could zoom way up and you can see that there's still a little bit of space. So you could even go as far as 0.001, which is the smallest number you can type in the cinema. And now they are so close to that edge that it should be fine. You can't go to 0 because, like I said, it won't know what side of the polygon it's on. So that's what backtrack does. You don't really need to worry about it too much unless you're in a really, really, really tiny scene.